As I made the point many times on this show, if you keep saying that people are Hitler and the Nazis, a deranged mind is going to compute that as a direct incentive to perform a public duty, a service to the country, by removing Hitler and the Nazis and expect to be applauded for it.
So Piers Morgan just delivered one of the most honest takes on political violence in America, and it's exactly what the establishment doesn't want to hear. He's connecting the dots between inflammatory rhetoric and real-world violence that mainstream media refuses to acknowledge. Let's break this down.
The Center for Strategic and International Studies reported in September, it said in recent years, the United States has seen an increase in the number of left-wing terrorism attacks and plots, although such violence has risen from very low levels and remains much lower than historical levels of violence carried out by right-wing and jihadist attackers. But they note that 2025 marks the first time in more than 30 years that left-wing terrorist attacks outnumber those from the violent far right. And I think that is a pertinent point, which is if you go back in the last 30, 40 years, you'll see there's been a lot of violence on the right, a lot of violence on the left. But there's now a noticeable uptick in violence on the left.
The Center for Strategic and International Studies isn't some partisan think tank. They're the gold standard for security analysis. This data completely demolishes the narrative that right-wing extremism is the only threat. For the first time in 3 decades, left-wing attacks are outpacing far-right violence.
And many people, and I would be one of them, would apportion that, I think, to the ridiculously over-the-top rhetoric that's often used about Donald Trump and his administration, calling him Hitler, calling them a bunch of Nazis and so on.
This is the logical endpoint of years of Hitler comparisons. When you convince someone they're facing literal Nazis, violence becomes a moral imperative. The 2 Trump assassination attempts both involve shooters who consumed exactly this type of rhetoric from mainstream sources.
And that's the problem. If you over-egg the rhetorical souffle in that way, you are going to make impressionable minds think this is a good thing to be doing.
Perfect metaphor. History shows us that people who genuinely believed they were stopping Hitler felt completely justified in violence. The left has weaponized this exact psychology, creating a permission structure for political assassination under the guise of moral duty.
The murder of Brian Thompson, the CEO of United Healthcare, shot brazenly in the streets of New York, where I currently am, and the lionization by many on the left, especially younger members of the left, of his killer, Luigi Mangione, the idea he was some kind of modern-day Robin Hood hero for murdering a husband, a father, a son, in the way that that was done. The reaction was almost as appalling as the murder itself. It's like, this guy's not a hero. He's a cold-blooded assassin of the kind that we used to be able to all agree should be condemned by everybody, but that didn't happen.
The contrast is staggering. The same people clutching pearls about January 6th were literally celebrating a cold-blooded murderer. Luigi Mangione became a folk hero on social media, while these same voices lecture us about dangerous rhetoric. Pure hypocrisy.
And this is my problem, is I think, Joe, that people's reactions, they're sensitive. We're getting numbed to this stuff to the degree that people think it's perfectly okay to say, you know what, he had a point, that Mangione, and by the way, he's good looking, isn't he? What? What? You know what I mean?
We're witnessing the complete breakdown of basic moral guardrails. When murder becomes acceptable if the victim represents the right target, civil society collapses. The romanticization of political violence always starts with supposedly justified exceptions.
When you continually call a man a Hitler, a rapist, a pedophile, all these things he got called on, by 60 Minutes, which I thought was disgraceful for Nora O'Donnell to say that, because she would never have repeated what was in that maniac's manifesto if it had been Obama sitting there or Biden.
CBS would never amplify a shooter's manifesto targeting Obama or Biden. They'd call it journalistic malpractice. But when it's Trump, suddenly repeating unverified defamatory claims from a terrorist becomes legitimate journalism. The double standard is undeniable.
But I do know that in the manifesto this warped shooter had, he didn't say alleged or protector. He said he was a pedophile and was a rapist. And CBS 60 Minutes then repeated that as if it didn't matter. But actually it does matter. And then for Nora O'Donnell to say, oh, well, you think he meant you? Of course she knew who the guy was talking about. Of course, she knew it was highly defamatory.
This violated every principle of responsible journalism. Repeating unsubstantiated claims from a would-be assassin's manifesto without verification is weaponizing violence for political gain. CBS essentially gave that shooter a platform to spread his propaganda on national television.
Of course, she knew it was incredibly abusive to Trump to do that in an interview for 60 minutes, and Trump understandably lost his rag. So I do think it's a two-way street.
This was clearly a setup designed to provoke an angry response they could then weaponize. O'Donnell knew exactly what she was doing, repeating defamatory claims, then acting innocent when Trump rightfully objected. Classic media manipulation tactics.
There is a double standard about the way that many on the left and the media, which is very left skewed, I'm sorry, it is in America. I see it all the time. I've worked in it long enough to see it. And there is a double standard about the way Trump gets treated compared to anybody else.
He's worked in British and American media for decades, seeing both systems up close. When someone with his international perspective says American media is heavily left skewed, that carries real weight. He's not some partisan hack. He's calling it as he sees it.
Should the others look at themselves and think, are we partly to blame for the mindset of a apparently, genius level guy who was an award-winning teacher, no sign of any violence, suddenly deciding to get on a train from California to Washington
Piers,
to plan a massacre at the White House? How is that happened? I don't know the answer. But I do know the language that he repeated in that manifesto was very similar to a lot of the bullshit language I hear about Trump all the time from the left. And that has to change too.
This wasn't organic radicalization. It was systematic programming. A high-functioning educator doesn't suddenly plan mass murder without external influence. The rhetoric he absorbed directly mirrors what passes for mainstream political commentary about Trump.
The intellectually honest position on this is surely that you should be able to condemn whatever party you have an allegiance to, whatever, you should be able to condemn unreservedly all violence against police on January the 6th and all violence against police or civilians or stores or whatever during any of the BLM riots. To me, that is an intellectually honest position. The moment you start saying, well, that side were terrible, when they rioted, it was acceptable. When they did it, it's unacceptable. The moment you start doing that, you're being intellectually, to me, dishonest.
This is what intellectual honesty looks like. Condemning all political violence regardless of the perpetrator's ideology. Most people have completely abandoned this principle, applying different standards based on whether they agree with the cause.
The level of violent rhetoric and violent action in American political discourse and American politics is completely out of hand. It's out of control. And nobody seems to want to put a control valve in. Each time there's an incident, everyone expresses their outrage, but at the same time seems to want to pin the blame on everybody but themselves.
It's a perpetual cycle of manufactured outrage and deflection. Everyone performs concern while simultaneously stoking the very conditions that guarantee more violence. Nobody wants to take responsibility because that would require changing their own behavior.
And I think AI is going to make this a lot worse because it'll become increasingly hard to be able to tell reality from fiction. And so people will have their natural political bias sort of cemented and fermented by AI in a way that I think is going to get increasingly dangerous.
AI will supercharge existing echo chambers, creating hyper-personalized propaganda that feels completely real. Deepfakes, manipulated evidence, and algorithmic radicalization will make current political violence look quaint. We're heading towards something much darker.